which is the key difference between product and engineering, right? It's the what versus the how. Whether that's different people, same people shifting around, if they can get those two jobs done, I think it's all good. And I think there is going to be a lot more of like gray and people having experiences on both sides, which I think is actually great.
What do you do for your team, your technologists on your team and your organizations to help them get that kind of product mindedness, or at least to start thinking that way?
Yeah, I think one of the big things for engineering teams is just having some kind of contact with customers.
In this episode, Stacie Frederick, Chief Product Officer at Stanza, discusses how her engineering background informs her product management approach, emphasizing the importance of understanding user needs, developing clear customer personas, and how technologists can develop a product mindset.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rob Osell, VP of Innovation at This.Labs, here for another episode in our series about engineering leadership. Today, I'm here with Stacie Frederick. Stacie is the Chief Product Officer at Stanza. Stacie, how are you doing?
Hey, Rob. Doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for being here.
Sure.
I think, one of the questions that I have for you that's so fascinating is that in your career, you've really been a member of leadership from many different angles at many different places, up and down, and many different sort of seats. Notably, you've been both a CTO and now a Chief Product Officer. And I was just kind of curious for, as a way of introduction, how has that transition been for you? Was that an intentional thing to kind of make that transition? And how has that been for you?
Yeah, I will say stepping into more of a product role here at Stanza, I would say is more a matter of specific to Stanza. And that's because it is a technical product. It's for engineers and engineering teams. And so I felt like as someone who has led engineering teams, I had a pretty good hold of who the customer was. And so that was useful to bring to Stanza, that perspective. And also it felt more natural than, say, there are, I would say, products that I would not sign up to be a product person for because it's too much of a stretch from where I've spent many, many years. It's nice to be able to have kind of the speed of thought for myself and decision making when it's something that you've had a lot of experience in versus something that you're having to stretch for on a regular basis. I find that's not as much fun.
So talk about that hesitation a little bit, right? Because you're not necessarily saying that there's anything about the product that's a problem here. It's not an objection to the company or the product, but something else, right? What is that thing that is giving you that hesitation?
Yeah, I think a large part of it is just being able to identify with your users, understanding kind of, their perspective, what they need, what they want. Some users are much easier for us to kind of relate to, right? And to understand what their challenges might be or where there might be needs or sticking points or what would be a great solution for some users. And others were just like, oh, that's interesting, but they're way over there. Like I've never come into contact myself in my life with that type of user or what they're trying to do. So that's a lot harder. I find that to be a lot harder for me, at least.
Yeah, it's like sometimes we give ourselves a little bit too much credit for what we know about people, but when we are forced to like account for how we know that, we're like, oh, I read it in a book once, or I saw it on TV once, and suddenly you realize I don't actually know real people who are my users.
Yeah, and I would say there are times where you may want to, but it's kind of like, am I up for the amount of like research and kind of just building my knowledge about that, either that domain, that discipline, that industry, whatever it is. Sometimes that's exciting to embark on a whole new industry or a whole new area, right? I would say at this point I was not looking for that. So this was Stanza felt like a pretty natural fit.
Interesting. So like, is that a situation where you need to like a product role is one where you kind of have had to build some experience, like I guess an experience using products, experiences building maybe things where you didn't fully understand what it meant to be users, and you kind of are like accumulating that wisdom and then like you get that great success in the product role? Or is it possible to just jump into product like right from ground zero? I guess it just depends on what it is relative to who you are.
Yeah, I think it varies person to person. So I've worked with great product managers who have always been product managers. And then I know for myself it helps me a lot when I understand what the problem space is and the users, right, the customer need. It's just, I don't know why. Maybe it's just the way my brain works, but I'm used to like being able to think about problems, like not having to wrestle with that, as well as being able to get to decisions in a pretty, easy way or quick way. And so I find that when I don't have that speed, it's like it is a very friction-full experience, and that's not as much fun.
Yeah, like what is happening when you're in that friction? I think that's like an interesting just sensation of what that's like.
Yeah, I have to say it's the explicitly taking yourself out of your own world and trying to put yourself in another world, and almost like regularly reminding yourself that like you have to like regularly like teleport yourself. Like, okay, now I'm sitting in this room. I am this user. They are trying to use this thing. What would be my questions, problems, things I'm trying to get done? And the effort to do that on a regular basis can be, I find it just takes too much effort. Like, I need all my energy to do just my job.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I know that this is one of the reasons why people advocate for the use of personas, like not just personas as people, but like with full stories. Like, this is not just who this person is, but this is how old they are. This is where they went to school. This is, how, what problems they're having with their kid at school, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like some these really engrossing ones. Do you find that helps with that? Or do you think that friction will always be there if that person just doesn't speak to any part of like kind of your experience or kind of your intuition?
No, I think the personas are a fantastic way to do that. Not only for me, but also I think when you're trying to get a whole team into the same space, right? The same context. And particularly if what I think is really great about personas is it helps you to untangle the different types of users, how there might be different expectations, different skill levels, different things that they're trying to do. That's a little bit more nuanced. Like you can't just throw, the user. It's actually, no, for this specific user, this is their priority list. And for this other user, it's a different priority list. And that like further refining of who the person is that you're building for and what you're building for them really helps. Like the clarity that you get as usual, right? The clarity of requirements, the clarity of understanding, you always end up with better solutions.
Yeah, I think it's really easy, right? To sometimes, even if you understand your users, products often have more than one user class.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so you can sometimes abstract that away and create like a user cloud where you just sort of go, this user collectively has these experiences. And sometimes it's really great to be able to say, hey, we left Susie in the dust like 2 versions ago. She's no longer being served by what we're building. Are we okay with that? Because, I think it's good to be able to find individuals inside of that user base. Yeah,
it's interesting how actually important that is. And I would say it's something that I probably will no longer put aside in terms of, does this company understand who their user is? Because I actually have been at one who didn't have clarity on that, and it was amazing how much friction, how much toil it really caused for them in terms of what is the right thing to build to be successful with this set of customers we're trying to go after. And it was interesting. It was a regular like head-on thing between teams.
Yeah.
Because it was like, at one point there'd be clarity on we need to do this thing. And then all of a sudden someone would come back with a question around, but no, our goal was to do this. And that was at odds. And so there's automatically just, what are we really solving for? Who is our user? And it was amazing that they did not have a clear answer for that. And this was a company that was around for a good 7 years.
And I bet you it was probably the case that they had a lot of data. They probably even had a lot of user analytics. But the point is that those aren't people.
Yeah.
I think maybe that's maybe you'd agree that that's a sign that you have lost track of your users is if all the conversations revolve around data. Because I love data as much as the next person, but listen, data doesn't show truth. Data hints at truth, but it can often be abused. And so, you can get into these like battles between organizations or stakeholders when they're like, well, the data says this and the data says this. And it's like, well, but who's the real user here?
Yeah.
What do they actually want?
Exactly. And I do think it's a subtle thing of understanding that there will be there's almost like a different set of users that come into contact with your product. And if you're not able to define that clearly in terms of who is really like your core user versus like what, there's a framework that I'm using and they call them lifecycle users. It's all the other people that come in contact with your product through the life cycle of it. And you do have to build stuff to satisfy those folks, while also building stuff to satisfy your core user, who is the person getting the most value out of it. And then, there's your often financial user, who's actually buying it.
Yeah, those aren't always the same users. Yep, exactly.
Very unusual for it to be all the same, which probably is more consumer-like, which you get all of them. But if you're not untangling those, you will end up with these sometimes impossible to decide, which is the analysis paralysis, or you're just like it feels like a uncohesive set of things that you're trying to build, and the feedback that you're coming in is like we're all over the place. Like we got bugs here, bugs here, and it feels like you're never making progress on any of them.
Have you ever had that experience where you're working on a team and you're doing like user research and people are saying, we love it, this is great, and you forgot to ask, well, would you pay for this? And suddenly you go like, would you pay for this? And they go, no, absolutely not. And you're like, well, wait a second, you just said you loved it. You're like, yeah, but those liking it and paying for it are two different worlds.
Absolutely. And that's one thing with Stanza as a early stage startup, is like that's like right in our face, and we're doing a lot of that. And it's super interesting how difficult it is just to ask that question. And that's the whole, social interaction is like there is so much, I would say, mystery in terms of the people-to-people part.
What do you feel about like building to the customers, the users you have versus the users you want? Is there any element of that, or is that a luxury that a lot of companies can't afford? Like, or that precedes a pivot? Like, what is that? How do you deal with that?
Yeah. Well, I would say for most startups, or even just for most products, you actually have to be thinking about both and all. And it's more a question of how do your users or your products sit on a spectrum?
What is that spectrum?
Like, yeah, exactly. So is it like your beginning users versus your advanced users?
Okay.
For your small companies, maybe versus your large companies, the team they're in is like at the beginning of this thing they're trying to do, or they're super advanced at it. And not understanding that also is, I think, where your features or part of your products can fall short. Right? Because you want to be able to continue to grow with your users and your customers as you continue to use your products. And also be able to make sure you're inviting new ones to come in.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's just the part of it that always sits with me is there's like this classic example. I think they use it a lot in product sort of development conversations, but it's about like the World War planes, and they started looking at all the planes that came back and where the bullet holes were. So they decided, this is where we need to put the armor. And it turns out it does nothing, because what they wanted to take the data from was the planes that didn't make it back.
Right.
And so sometimes I think about that when it comes down to users. It's like we take a lot of analytics and a lot of research of the users we have, not necessarily considering that maybe there's a class of users we really want, but they're just shut out from the current version of the app. But at the same time, that also sounds a little bit like I'm holding out for a thing I don't have instead of taking advantage of the thing I have. It just sounds like for startups, this has got to be a really tough push and pull between doubling down on the users you have and the product you've apparently developed versus trying to figure out where you've shut out the users that you are actually trying to reach and opening that door for them.
Yeah, and I think that's where keeping an eye on the jobs to be done is really important, and doing kind of that digging underneath to understand what is the real problem that you're trying to solve, and how are you helping your users along the way to solving that problem, because there may be pieces of it. And it's kind of like, what is that ordering of those pieces that we're taking our users on? Does that make sense? Right? Which is where you could potentially pick up more users and different users along the way as you're building this more like holistic solution, potentially. I do think it's also important for teams that are building products to have a perspective on what are you, like have an opinion on what you're building and how you are literally leading your users to a better place, really, because that's how you're creating value, right? Is that you're actually providing something better than what they have today. And so how are you taking them there?
We talked about friction.
Yeah.
One of the ways that you can have friction is when your users are telling you something that you don't agree with your users about.
Yep.
You might empathize with them, but you're like, I don't understand why you want this.
Yep.
Like, do you think that if you find yourself in that situation that it's a sign that maybe you're not as in tune with those particular users or that particular product? Or do you think that you need to leave space for your users to be able to win you over, to, convince you that maybe they were right?
I think it is a matter of getting to that understanding. So what is causing that? Like this especially happens when they're asking for a specific solution. And you're kind of like, why? Why that specific thing? Like, why that button? Why that button there? And so that's where the questioning, right, the curiosity around, so what is the problem you're really just trying to solve for? And then having that, the time to think about, is that really the best way to solve for it, just given what you know about product and your plans? Because maybe there's a different, better solution than what they really want, but to help them to get to that solved solution is really what they want, not so much the button.
Yeah, that's a tough thing for people to get used to, right? Is that idea that like users are very good at knowing what's bothering them, but not always nearly as good at knowing what would fix their problem.
Right. Which is the key difference between product and engineering, right? It's the what versus the how.
Oh, I like that. Explain that a little bit more.
Yeah, so for me, product is more about what is the problem that you're solving and defining what are all the requirements around the things that you need to solve for. Engineering is more about, okay, how are we going to solve that problem? What is the solution we're going to provide? And so to me, it's the exercise for product is to divorce yourself from the how, like keep the blinder on. Do not go down that path. Oftentimes when someone starts talking about specific things they want to use in a solution, it's like, okay, we need to take a step back. We need to talk about what is the problem we're looking to solve, divorced from the technologies, the things you're going to use to solve the problem. Can we make sure we have clarity on just the problem and the requirements?
All right, we're going to jump right back into this, but before we continue, I just wanted to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, This.Labs. This.Labs is a consultancy focused on helping companies with their digital transformation efforts, and that might sound like a buzzword, but what it means is helping companies align their business objectives with their digital efforts, whether that be replatforming, modernizing, or spinning up new projects. This.dot has worked with companies like Stripe, Xero, Wikimedia, DocuSign, and Twilio. Check them out at this.co. That's THISDOT.co. All right, now back to our show. So, Stacie, what was interesting in what you just said to me, right, this idea of the what and the how, is that you have taken on the two sides of this, been both in product and in technology. So has your technology and your ability to understand, or even if you're trying to keep the blinders on, to intuit the how it will be built, invading your thought process? Does that make you a less effective product person or a more effective one? Like, how do you see how that's either helped or hindered you?
Yeah, it's both. On the one hand, it's super easy to identify with the engineering team who like has a handle on a solution and it's like, just let us go build it. And you're like, okay. Without doing the work of actually defining all the requirements to make sure that that is, in fact, the best right way to build it. So it is easy to get sucked into that. So it is kind of like, again, I remind myself regularly, like, am I talking about the what or am I talking about the how? And it almost is actually nice to like free myself from having to think about the solution and just to focus on the requirements and just say, have I gotten all the requirements? And if I get questions, like, that's great, because that means I can go hunt down what a requirement is or better define what we're trying to solve for. On the other hand, it's really great because I'm probably less likely to go off on a tangent that is going to be way more like really hard to do.
Oh, true. Yeah.
Right.
Implicitly. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Especially like the sequencing of stuff, or the what areas, starting to identify early, like what are the areas that are going to be really hard from a technical perspective. So that does help.
It's been argued that product and engineering, which have long been sort of considered maybe different, sometimes even siloed entirely from top to bottom, and partnered often, obviously, but that they might be melding a bit more than usual, like product people being more enabled to be technologists through like things like AI, and technologists being aided by being able to think about their users. What are your thoughts on this? Like, do you think that these things will stay pretty strongly distinct sort of expertise buckets, or do you think that there will be at least some melding? Like we have front end developers and back end developers, right? They're still developers, but they're different specialties of this. Will these become specialties of the same thing over time, or do you think that there's enough air between them to be like distinct disciplines?
I think teams, you can tell when teams actually have really good synergies. And this is among, design and front end. This is things like your engineering teams and whatever, QA ops, whatever other teams they have to partner with. Anytime you have really good understanding of and communication between those teams or those folks or someone with those skills, you're often getting much better solutions. It's faster to get to good solid solutions. And I think it's the same for product and eng. When you have really good people, either different people or same people, but they're able to, one, do the two jobs still, defining the what versus the how, and then executing on those. Whether that's different people, same people shifting around, if they can get those two jobs done, I think it's all good. And I think there is going to be a lot more of gray and people having experiences on both sides, which I think is actually great.
What do you do for your team, your technologists on your team and your organizations to help them get that kind of product mindedness, or at least to start thinking that way? Like, are there activities you do? Is it just by just making them exposed to it? What are types of the things that you do to kind of help foster this mentality with people that otherwise haven't thought that way?
Yeah, I think one of the big things for engineering teams is just having some kind of contact with customers. So one thing that I found really helpful is just to have customer spotlights, or are there opportunities for engineers to have some hear, see, whatever, come into contact with customers, what their experience is like, their reactions. So that is one piece that I do think is we need to do way more of on a regular basis.
I'll tell you one thing that works if you have the ability to do it, and I've known CEOs that do this too, to help keep in touch with it, is to take tickets, support tickets.
Yeah.
Nothing will help you empathize with your users more than working support tickets.
Yep.
Because you really have to think about the problems, not the tech, when you're answering those tickets.
Yep. Definitely that, and then also understanding. So when you get into technical conversations, you're talking about things, should we do this, should we do that? It's being very explicit about, so what is the business requirement, or what's the product requirement, or did we miss something there? And it's calling that out in terms of, this is why the product, the stuff that comes out of product it's so important for the engineering piece, and getting that right, quote unquote. Because it's those requirements that you're basically using to gauge how good your technical solution is, which is often where we go off on the engineering side. Sometimes we miss that.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the regular reminders that I have in terms of really regularly saying, for the product requirements, this is the what, this is the problem we're trying to solve. This is drawing out the customer, trying to make that very clear, but also explicit about, this is a thing we need. If you don't have enough of it, we need more of it. And this is how it informs the technical piece of it. So I think a lot of it is just making that a part of your daily work, how you work, what your expectations are. That makes a big difference.
I love to, because I know working with technologists and developers and things, that you'll get into conversations with people where it's well, if they were to push this button and activate this feature and do this at the same time, it would blow up the whole system. And what I'd love to do is, even if you don't have formal personas that your team tracks on, or that the developers would have a sense of, is to just say, introduce me to this person. Who are they? What were they trying to do today? Did they miss their second cup of coffee? What's going on here with this person? And I found that helped make conversations around prioritization tremendously simpler. Like, even if they didn't have the formal personas, but even just making a person come up with a human being who was trying to do this. And then oftentimes the conversations just dissolve and they go, yeah, that's not really a user case. That probably matters.
Yeah. It's true. It's always interesting, to bring it back to users and what it really means to them is always a very useful exercise.
Well, talk a little bit about we talked about like why product people maybe can get some value from having a connection with the technology, and a little bit about the opposite. But we talked earlier about the friction that someone in the product role feels if they can't empathize with the users. Would you go so far as to say that this is something that you would be looking for when you're looking to hire technology people as well? Like, is this a thing that should maybe be more captured across kind of one's team, is to say, like, hey, you don't have to know our users inside and out and things like that, but you got to be maybe excited by the users and what they're facing and their problems. Is that something that you would screen for, like in hiring?
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is I think there's a tuning to that according to what you're working on. So if, for example, you are deep in infrastructure, very far away from users, it's probably not as high up in the prioritization list of what you're looking for in a person. However, if you're someone who's working really close to the user, that's going to be really high, right? In terms of, I want to make sure someone who that's important to them. It's important to them, and they are good at being able to figure out how to learn about their users and are curious on a regular basis. So,
I think that's what's cool, right? Is that the idea is that not that everybody has to be a user, or have that experience, because different people are going to be more easily able to slip into the skin of users through whatever means that works for them. But they have to at least show an interest in doing it, right? Like, you probably want to avoid the people that are just like, I would prefer to just move bits around and I don't care who it's for. It could be this person, that person, doesn't matter to me.
Yeah, there's also another part of this, which is a little bit of a twist, but it applies, is for technology folks, they're coming into a company that's in a specific industry. Do you understand the differences of this software that you're building in this industry versus, say, the software that you've built at, large internet company, super high tech company? And having worked in health tech, that's one of the things that I absolutely started screening for, because it's a very different, the environments are very different, kind of you're crossing very different disciplines. And so those other disciplines actually have a different, they work in a different world and they bring that into the company. Are you open to that? Are you interested in actually a non-high tech company? And that's even at that level is interesting to know, how open people are to better understanding, this thing is actually quite different from what you're coming from. Do you realize that? And it's to the point of culture within your company.
Yeah, for sure. Right. I mean, because I've seen it from both sides, right? Technologists working in a non-tech company who sort of don't care about the core business, and vice versa. The core business people who just sort of think that the tech people are the people that keep the printers on, right? They don't, there's not that appreciation and that bi-directional appreciation. And that if you don't have that, it's hard to bridge that divide. To be the first person to cross the bridge is actually really, really tough.
Yeah, it's interesting that you don't realize how much that can feel like you're in a stranger in a strange world. Right, on a regular basis. But that is one thing that I really took away from working in health tech. And I think one of the things that those companies really have to be good at to be really successful is, if you are in health tech and you're trying to basically bring, medicine into a place that's leveraging or needs to have people from a high tech background, there are culture clashes there. It's pretty interesting, but it's like, if you're a company who can find a way through that, or find the right people to be able to bridge back and forth, that's one of the success factors they need to have.
Yeah, I love that. I love that insight, because that really brings it into focus. And I think for tech people that are trying to get those jobs as well. I mean, that's something that you have to be able to demonstrate. Because yeah, it's not always going to be the case that tech is a pure endeavor for its own sake, as it can be in some, if you work at Amazon, or I guess not even Amazon, but I mean, if you work at Google or whatever, these types of companies that are really kind of everything runs in stream with each other.
No, it's interesting because it's just a different way of thinking about problems and what's important, how they invest in different things, all the way down to, how they think about empowering people, which I think a lot of times when we come out of high tech, we take that for granted. And we don't realize that there actually are other industries that have, really long-running industries that are used to running in a very different type of organizational structure.
Yes.
And we don't think twice about it. We think like, oh yeah, of course, all our teams, we make decisions, we voice our opinions. We're used to speaking up and being able to ask questions, very direct questions of anybody. Whereas you go to some of these other companies who maybe have a different, their leadership structure has people who come out of medicine, real estate, all these other long-running industries. They take a very different approach.
It's one of the biggest reasons I enjoy doing consulting. It's what keeps me going with it. It is fun to get access to so many different types of companies, like you said, big and small, in so many different industries, because they just work so differently.
Yep.
Whether it's insurance or banking or product retail or whatever else. It's if you're the type of person that enjoys that.
Yeah.
If you're a people watcher type of person,
yes.
It's a really enjoyable part of the job.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, listen, I mean, very rapidly, we've come to the end of our time here. So can you help people understand where they can find you and maybe Stanza online in case they're curious of finding out more?
Yeah. For Stanza, we're at stanza.systems. That's the company website. And for, I guess, the quick line on us is that we are trying to basically help every development team get better at reliability engineering. And so trying to make that really easy and simple in terms of how do you build reliable software just right out of the gate. For me, you can find me at Stacie at stanza.systems.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Thanks. That's going to be it for us today.
All right.
Thank you so much, Stacie, for being our guest, and thanks to each of you for listening. We hope to see you next time. As we close out, I'd like to thank our sponsor, This.Labs, one last time, who would like me to remind you that sometimes it's hard to bridge the gap between business objectives and tech implementation. It can get messy. This. Is trusted by top names like Meta, Google, and T-Mobile, and they love helping business leaders fulfill their strategic digital initiatives. Check them out at this.co. One more time, that's THISDOT.co. Thanks, everybody.